from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Will the meeting make a difference? Welcome to the Monday edition as President Trump meets with congressional leaders at the White House just a day until a possible government shutdown. We've got a lot on the plate for us today. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. Tyler, that meeting is going to come after the president's meetings today with Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, the news conference that will follow could begin in just about 15 minutes time, assuming it takes place on schedule.
Right, exactly. A jam-packed day on multiple fronts here, Joe. We could potentially get some sort of movement when it comes to funding the government. And we're still waiting to see if there's going to be an agreement here towards ending the war between Israel and Hamas. That's
right. They've got a ceasefire and a 21-point plan on the table here, knowing that this has been a bit difficult, at least certain parts of it, difficult for Netanyahu to accept. The fact that they're facing reporters might give us a sense, though, of at least their hope to have a productive day here, Tyler. They've been behind closed doors now for about 2 hours.
Right, and we saw when President Trump greeted the Israeli prime minister today in front of the West Wing, he was asked about how these talks were going. He said he was, quote, very confident that there would be a peace deal.
In the Oval a bit later on today, not only the two Republican leaders, Thune and Johnson, but also Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the first time President Trump has in fact met with him, knowing that Wednesday, 12:01, tomorrow night, if you will, the government's set to shut down if they don't get a deal together here. There are some rumblings about an even shorter term CR to buy a couple of days, Tyler. We'll see if that emerges.
I was going to say, are we just going to go over this again? Because maybe there'll be an even shorter term CR. But right now, the Senate is looking at potentially kicking down the can down the road for 7 weeks until November 21st. So are we just going to be having this conversation?
It's CR heaven. We do a lot of kicking of the can around here. I want to let you know, Dusty Johnson, the congressman from South Dakota, is going to be talking with us in just a moment after we check Wall Street. Investors are looking at all of this as well. And Alexis Christoforous has the markets for us live from New York. Alexis, how's it look?
You bet. Thanks, Joe. A mixed market right now, but tech stocks stealing the show once again on Wall Street as we move closer to that possible government shutdown. The Dow Industrials down 56 points. Broader market higher with the S&P up about 11. NASDAQ gaining 101 points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.13%. The 2-year sitting at 3.62%. And we have got gold back at a record high, now trading at $38.32 an ounce. West Texas Intermediate oil down nearly 4% at $63.27 a barrel. Electronic Arts up nearly 5%. The maker of Madden, NFL, Apex Legends, and other video games agreeing to go private in a $55 billion leveraged buyout, the largest on record. The buyers here, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, Silver Lake Partners, and President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner's Affinity Partners. Shares of Carnival reversing an earlier gain, down now nearly 5% after the cruise operator posted better than expected quarterly results and raised its full-year outlook. Shares, by the way, were up 23% this year. Heading into today's earnings report, we've got shares of Norwegian and Royal Caribbean down in sympathy. Peloton preparing to roll out refreshed hardware and a software overhaul for its bikes and treadmills that include AI for personalization. Not impressing Wall Street, though. Shares of Peloton down more than 3%. And China's Huawei is planning to double output of its top AI chips in a bid to win customers as NVIDIA deals with those geopolitical headwinds. We've got shares of NVIDIA up, though, nearly 2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alexis Christoforous. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back to Balance of Power now with Joe Mathieu and Tyler Kendall.
All right, Alexis, thank you so much. Live from New York, Alexis Christoforous will have more on the markets, assuming our news conference doesn't begin before then. Just about 15 minutes from now, we'll check back on the Monday trade. I'm Joe Mathieu, indeed, alongside Tyler Kendall for the balance of this week here on Balance of Power. And Tyler, it's great to have you standing with us here as we cover some pretty heady stuff today. We're 2 days out, less than actually a day and change from a potential government shutdown. We're going to be talking about that in just a second with Dusty Johnson. We've also got our eyes on geopolitics as President Trump meets with Benjamin Netanyahu. They are going to emerge at some point here this hour in a live news conference that will bring you live here on Bloomberg.
Right, a lot of different angles that we're watching for here, and particularly when it comes to the shutdown and the clock that is ticking tomorrow. Yeah. We know that Republicans ultimately need at least 7 Democrats to get on board. Republicans, 53 votes, they need to get over to 60 in order to reach any sort of deal. So the question becomes, are they able to get that many to come over? Can they strike this deal before we ultimately careen into a shutdown?
Let's ask that question of someone who knows more than we do about this current moment in time. Dusty Johnson, the Republican from South Dakota, is with us now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. And Congressman, it's great to have you back. Our viewers and listeners should know that you were pivotal in the background in getting the president's big, beautiful bill across the finish line. You've been through a lot of these shutdown scenarios before, and I'm wondering what your gut tells you now. Does this meeting lead to something today? Is there an 11th hour save, or should we prepare for the lights to go out?
It would be wonderful if the big boys and the big girls in Washington, if we could get our act together and avoid the shutdown, but it really doesn't look like that's going to happen. It feels to me like we've got an 85% chance of going into shutdown. We have passed a bipartisan short-term funding deal out of the House on a bipartisan basis. Chuck Schumer does not seem interested in accepting that deal, and I think he seems pretty committed to a shutdown. I think that's where we're headed.
Congressman, do you see any sort of compromise that could emerge, in particular when it comes to extending the Obamacare premium subsidies that are set to expire? It seems like there might be some wiggle room on that provision, at least, whether that happens now or down the road if this short-term stopgap measure gets through.
What has sometimes been said is that nothing is as eternal as a government program. This is a little bit of proof of that. Here we've got some special assistance on health care, some subsidies that were put into place during the pandemic. And here we are having a hard time getting rid of them. Listen, let's say that reasonable people can disagree about whether or not working class Americans should have these additional enhanced tax credits. Most of the benefits go to insurance companies, but let's just set that aside and say reasonable people can disagree about that. What we shouldn't be debating is whether or not we're going to spend $1.5 trillion of new spending as a part of a 6-week short-term stopgap funding deal. This is really unprecedented that the Democrats are saying that, no, rather than negotiate on the health care stuff while the government is open, we prefer to negotiate while the government is shuttered. It seems like they're taking the American people hostage, and I just don't see how Republicans can go along with that.
Would you vote yes on a CR that had an extension of the Obamacare subsidies, or is that a deal breaker for you, Congressman? Because I know that you also have a piece of legislation that would deal with this on a much shorter term level and, in fact, prevent the government, if I read it right, from ever shutting down.
Yeah, shutdowns are stupid. We should not shut down. My bill with Senator Ron Johnson in the Senate, the Eliminate Shutdowns Act, would say anytime the clowns in D.C., we can't get our act together, rather than take the American economy hostage, we're just going to have a short-term 14-day CR to allow the politicians to get to yes. And that is, in essence, exactly what the Republican offer is today. Not for 2 weeks, but for 6 or 7 weeks until the Friday before Thanksgiving. It is unprecedented that a party would say, no, we don't want to negotiate for 6 weeks. Instead of negotiating, we're going to shut the whole thing down because we can't secure $1.5 trillion in new health care subsidies. I just think Chuck Schumer is asking for heaven and earth and spending and health care for illegal aliens and health care subsidies for rich Americans. There is no way on God's green earth that Republicans are going to give all of that up in return for just a 6-week stopgap.
Well, Congressman, what's also raised the stakes of these negotiations, perhaps, is that we know that there's been this OMB memo threatening permanent layoffs if the government does shut down. Do you think that's the right strategy here by Republicans to potentially use a shutdown period to slash the federal workforce?
In general, the party that loses the shutdown loses it because they don't seem reasonable. So right now, today, it's pretty clear to me that the Republican ask is very basic. It's not a Republican win or a Democrat win. It's just, hey, let's keep the government open for 6 weeks while we negotiate. That is eminently reasonable, which means that I think that the current environment means that Democrats probably are going to be in some trouble. Now, I understand what the administration's trying to do, and Lord knows there is plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse to cut. So if they use that scalpel in a way that seems targeted and inappropriate, I think it can help the messaging. If they go in and they do things that are a little bit more nuclear, I think that could make Republicans seem not quite so reasonable. That could shift the political landscape. So I would just say I expect the administration to do the right thing in cutting government during the shutdown. I don't think it's just a threat. I think Russ' vote is absolutely serious. I think he and President Trump are going to cut the places they think are appropriate to cut if we're in shutdown.
Well, you speak of the Eliminate Shutdowns Act. As a matter of fact, we're going to have Senator Ron Johnson on with us on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 o'clock. So we've got both chambers covered here, Congressman. Isn't this the very reason why you're out? You're going to run for governor instead of put up with more of this?
No, I'm really not running away from Washington, D.C. I mean, it's been an honor of a lifetime. I do feel like I'm relevant. I get to be in a lot of rooms where we're trying to make America better. And frankly, the Republican House has done a much better job in the last 9 months than I think most people expected. So, no, I'm not running away from D.C. I'm really running toward my state that I love. And I think we've got some important things to do. And I think I'm the leader to help get them done.
And Congressman, I do want to pivot to another topic just quickly in our final minutes with you, and that has to do with tariffs, because we've seen a flurry of new announcements from President Trump in the past few days. And your fellow South Dakota colleague, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, did say, or suggested rather, in an interview over the weekend that there are discussions about a potential bailout for U.S. farmers. You, of course, represent a top agriculture producing state. I'm wondering if you've had any discussions about what those potential solutions would look like.
Yeah, the last time we got into a trade dispute with China, American farmers were, again, the tip of the spear. A lot of the harm of that trade dispute fell on farmers. So Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue did put together a pretty good plan in 2 different tranches to help American producers. We're probably in a better position today to be able to finance that than we were back then. We've got hundreds of billions of dollars of tariff revenue coming in. I think most members of Congress, whether they're urban or rural, understand that spending some of that tariff revenue to try to shave down some of the most jagged edges of what the American farmer is going through probably would be helpful. China's doing everything they can to hurt the American soybean farmer. We probably need to, we absolutely should help the American soybean farmer get through this rough patch.
Congressman, it's great to have you back. Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota, former chair of the Republican Main Street Association, now on his way in a campaign for governor. It's great to have you with us. We appreciate the insights. Of course, 12:01 a.m. Wednesday is when the government funding would lapse. 3 p.m. today, the president's meeting with congressional leaders. Only moments from now, we are expecting to hear from President Trump alongside Benjamin Netanyahu, who is in the White House right now. They've been meeting for a couple of hours, and a bilateral news conference has been scheduled. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, there's a live shot of the state dining room, which is adorned for this occasion. Folks are working their way in now, and we understand that the press pool is assembling, so this could begin shortly. It's great to have Dan Williams with us at this moment. We're about to hear details on a 21-point peace plan and hopes for a ceasefire, depending on what was discussed and what is being discussed behind closed doors with these 2 leaders. Dan is Bloomberg News reporter in Jerusalem and staying up a bit late for us this evening. Dan, it's great to have you. I'm just curious what the local coverage and local knowledge of the 21-point plan is and how much hope there is there for a breakthrough today.
Local coverage is wall to wall, going back, I'd say, as far back as the weekend when there were first leaked reports of this emerging plan. Israel, the Palestinians, the wider region seem to be gripped by what appears to be a rare optimism in this almost 2-year-old war. And I think it's no accident that the word peace is being used around this deal rather than ceasefire, which was previously used. Peace is far more affirmative a term. It's far more sweeping, certainly far more conclusive. And it does presuppose the exclusion, the toppling, the removal in one form or another of Hamas, which is sworn to basically open-ended ideological war against Israel. It also suggests that the U.S. president, perhaps even the Israeli prime minister, see ending the war in Gaza as a doorway to wider accommodation in the region, a long-awaited expansion of the Abraham Accords, which really was a centerpiece of Trump's foreign policy in his first term.
Dan, I also want to talk a little bit about the backdrop that these talks are coming on today. You have this great story out on the Bloomberg terminal entitled, quote, "Can Israel end the war with new push into Gaza City?" I'm wondering what your reporting has shown us about the answer to that question.
Well, not to make light of war making, but, you know, with every carrot, there is a stick. And to hear the Israelis tell it, the stick that might have brought Hamas into accepting this deal, a deal that Israel sees as being acceptable only if it disarms Hamas, if it sees an end to Hamas governance, and it recovers immediately the 48 hostages still in Hamas captivity. Israel says that basically Hamas was forced to this due to that military pressure, including most recently a military push, a very deep military push into Gaza City. That's the de facto capital of the Gaza Strip, of Hamas. Israeli forces have been there previously during this war, but this time it's a different method, different tactics. They're quite literally churning up the ground and below ground for any remnant of Hamas infrastructure, bunkers, weapon arsenals. Of course, there's been engagements with Hamas members. A number of soldiers have been killed. A number of Hamas fighters have been killed, Palestinian civilians as well. But most of the civilians of the Gaza City have actually fled under Israeli orders to displaced persons camps. And to hear the Israelis tell it, this is effectively the last push, the push which would either have seen Hamas destroyed militarily or destroyed diplomatically, if you like, by forcing it to surrender, lay down its arms, and cede power finally in the Gaza Strip. So yes, those things have been running in parallel. The Israeli argument is that as long as there's no ceasefire, fire will continue. And as long as there's no peace deal, certainly that firing will continue. However, we may see changes very, very soon, if indeed an hour from now, more or less, the US president, the Israeli prime minister announce that Hamas is on board for what would effectively be a deal ending this war and perhaps opening the situation up to a wider accommodation.
Would you take their word on that, Dan? And I ask you that because we've seen now 2 American presidents roll out multi-point peace plans that they said were accepted by both sides. And we learned after the fact that that was not the case. In fact, even Benjamin Netanyahu has wavered before Trump and Joe Biden on this matter.
I think yes. I think all around there is exhaustion. There is great pain. There is great trepidation about what the future holds for Palestinians. It's clearly existential. Much of the Gaza Strip has been ruined, really laid waste by this war. For Hamas, it's existential, more on an institutional level. Obviously, if you're a Hamas member now in battle, you face almost certain killing or capture. But it would appear that this deal would offer amnesty, immunity to Hamas members who surrender, perhaps even safe passage out of the Gaza Strip. And that sounds like a pretty good deal if it's a choice between life and death or life and an open-ended prison term in Israel. Now, for the Israelis, there is the resources have been strained, the national resources, on a level really not seen in decades by this war. Israel's international standing has plunged. And I think it's worth remembering the United States under this president is really the last big power backing Israel. Other powers have turned against it, including Security Council powers, which have actually recognized the Palestinian state unilaterally. And I would really reckon that if the US president is running out of patience, I think he clearly is, and is laying this down as the deal that must work, I think Israel, and perhaps not just Israel, will do everything in their power to make it work.
Well, Dan, you're laying out the stakes here in great detail for us. If Israel's going to do everything in their power to make it work, is there a route here? What happens if diplomacy does collapse? Is there any sort of mechanism in place that will ensure that the negotiations and the talks will keep going?
I don't think anyone is in this for continued open-ended talks. I think, as I referenced at the beginning of this interview, the nomenclature has changed. It's no longer talk of a ceasefire. A ceasefire is by definition temporary, cold-eyed, self-interested, and works on the assumption that firing will resume at the end of that ceasefire. Trump is talking about peace. He wants an end of this war, and he wants good news. And you know what? We're a few days away from the first week of October. That's traditionally when the Nobel Prize Committee announces it's the winner of the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the reason there is a sense of a rush around this is that the US president and his supporters are hoping that he will be named in the coming days for that Peace Prize, the Nobel. Indeed, the Israeli prime minister has already nominated him for that prize. So I think for various reasons, good, perhaps less good, immediate, less immediate, really there's a great sense of urgency here. It's also the second year mark, the second anniversary, if you like, of the war beginning, just over a week away. I think everyone would like to end the war before it becomes a 2-year war. It's already Israel's longest war. So really, there are so many vectors pointing now to a willingness to make this diplomacy work. It will not be open-ended diplomacy. I think what Trump will tell everyone involved is, I'm washing my hands of you if this doesn't work, and we'll just let the forces of war sort it out, which basically means Israel continues in the Gaza Strip, crushes Hamas militarily, potentially loses those hostages still surviving, loses more soldiers, more Palestinian civilians suffering, and then effectively a bloody, unquestionable end when there's simply no one left standing.
Boy, Dan Williams doing a wonderful job reporting for Bloomberg in Jerusalem. Dan, thank you so much for helping to set the table ahead of this news conference, which will be taking place today in the state dining room as opposed to the East Room, where you normally see the gold drapery behind the president and other world leaders. Today, we've got American and Israeli flags set up in the state dining room and a large room full of reporters and others who are looking to hear from these two men as soon as they start speaking. Of course, we will join them live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It was scheduled to begin 5 minutes ago, and things tend to slide on days like these. They've been behind closed doors since a little after 11 o'clock this morning, talking about the very issues that we just discussed with Dan. And we want to add the voice of Natasha Hall as we wait to hear from Trump and Netanyahu. Non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Natasha has been with us for several of the throes in this conflict and back today on an important meeting with these two world leaders. Natasha, it's great to have you. The last time Benjamin Netanyahu was in front of a large public gathering here in America was when he stood before an empty room in the UN General Assembly, knowing, of course, that many Muslim and African nations and even some European nations got up and walked out on him. What was that experience like in informing the Israeli prime minister of what he might be stepping into today?
Thank you for having me, Joe. I mean, I think that picture of Netanyahu in an empty room, which is supposed to include all of the world members, pretty much says it all. Israel is completely isolated in the world aside from President Trump in the United States. And so a lot comes down to this meeting with President Trump today, because what Netanyahu needs to show to Israelis is that they still have the backing of the United States. And if that wanes, then Israelis are in real trouble here. We are seeing more recognition of a Palestinian state, increasing support to the flotillas that are trying to get to Gaza, and really just this incredible support that's been thrown towards Palestinians and this rage about the ongoing war in Gaza. And so, I mean, I think that should have been a wake-up call. Maybe it should have been a wake-up call a long time ago for Netanyahu, but hopefully that portends something positive for these discussions this morning.
Well, Natasha, how is this pressure contributing to the talks today? We know at the center is this 21-point plan floated by the U.S. We've gleaned some details, including that it would include the release of all remaining hostages. 20 out of the remaining 48 are believed to still be alive. It would also include Israel gradually withdrawing troops from Gaza. From what you've seen, the reports about this plan, what is realistic for getting a deal done?
I mean, I think that's the ultimate question. And you mentioned pressure at the beginning of this. And I think the big issue to date, and I've said this multiple times on this program, is that we haven't seen tangible pressure from the United States at all in the past 2 years. And that has essentially been the reason that the war has gone on. And President Macron of France has recently said as much, that it is the United States that is capable of ending this war. And so unless we see real pressure on any of these points, these 21 points that Trump and Witkoff and others have laid out, I think we're not going to see much progress. We might see progress on those first few points, namely the release of the hostages. And what is interesting with this plan is it lays out the release of all 48 hostages, alive and dead, within the first 48 hours. Now, if that happens, then Netanyahu basically gets a pass from the biggest opposition to the continuation of this war, which is the hostage families. And so, there's a lot of things that can happen with the details of the rest of the points. And Netanyahu, as he has done in the past, could potentially continue the war if any of those points are not carried through.
I'm really compelled by this meeting yesterday in New York, Natasha. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Benjamin Netanyahu. They met for several hours, reportedly, to try to get ahead of some of the stickier points today. Is Jared Kushner going to be the one who solves this if it gets done?
There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, including former UK politician Tony Blair in this. And I think that the big issue is going to be Netanyahu agreeing to some of these points regarding amnesty for Hamas fighters that agree to peace, but namely and ultimately Palestinian statehood and a Palestinian governing authority in Gaza and the West Bank. Because Netanyahu quite defiantly in that UN General Assembly speech reiterated the fact that he is not in favor of a Palestinian state. And that is ultimately the core problem with this conflict, the lack of Palestinian self-determination. So the hope, I think, for a lot of people is that we can at least get to the point where we have aid flooding into an area stricken with famine, that we can have, at least a cessation of hostilities to save lives on the ground right now. But I think the details as they roll out are going to be very, very difficult. And, I would just point out that Israeli activists have recently put down a picture in front of the U.S. Embassy in Israel of Netanyahu with a Pinocchio nose sticking it into Trump's eyes, saying, "Don't be fooled again." And I think that pretty much says it all. I mean, Netanyahu is really a political animal. He's a survivor. And so he might agree to many, many points, but then say, but. And I think everything has to do with that but. So we could very well see a continuation of this war, but along other lines.
Well, another important meeting that happened last week in New York, we know that President Trump met with leaders of Arab nations, including Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. Natasha, how should we be looking at those countries in the region and what sort of role they play here when it comes to the future of the conflict and getting any sort of deal done?
I mean, they have tried to play a larger role in setting forth some kind of peace process or plan or redevelopment plan. And I think that the recent Israeli strike on Doha was really a red line for especially the GCC countries, the oil-rich Gulf countries in the region that are U.S. partners, because they saw this strike ultimately as a threat to their own security. And a threat to their relationship with the United States. And we saw this with this unprecedented security pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia recently, which was really, I think, ultimately not a warning necessarily, but showing the United States that there are other players in the world that they will have to seek alliances with if the U.S. cannot be counted on.
Interesting to see reporting last week, not to diverge too far from the path that is being discussed in this meeting, Natasha, but reporting by the Washington Post that Iran, for some years now, has been digging and tunneling into a much deeper facility than we even saw at Fordo, near the area that we bombed at Natanz. The idea that Iran could, in fact, be continuing to develop a nuclear weapons program is something that President Trump said he would act on if told about it, that there could be further strikes in Iran. How would that play into what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't doubt that Iran continues to have a desire to have some kind of nuclear program here, and that the destruction that we saw earlier this year is not the end of this issue. But what's interesting, if you connect it to what's happening right now with this 21-point plan that Trump is proposing, is when I was talking to diplomats earlier about what Netanyahu might do. What we've seen in the past when there's been ceasefire deals or potential peace agreements on display, he distracts through another strike somewhere in the region. So I think that's what we could potentially see again with Netanyahu talking to Trump about the need to deal with this threat that you just mentioned about Iran digging tunnels even further in.
And sticking with sort of the regional picture here, Axios had reported earlier that Netanyahu called Qatari officials to discuss the strike that we saw earlier this month in Doha against senior Hamas leadership. I'm wondering what you make of that dynamic, since we know that the Qataris have been a big force here when it comes to mediating in the peace talks.
I mean, it's hard to understate how unprecedented this strike was. Qatar has been used for many, many years now as a neutral place for mediation with the Iranians, with Hamas, et cetera. And so I think that the fact that, the Israelis hit Doha, actually killed a Qatari as well in the process, was really enraging for the Qataris. And so this phone call had to take place. One of those points in that 21-point plan is actually an agreement that Israel will not strike Qatar ever again. Very, very specific there, very intentional. And I think that the reason for that is the U.S. needs to show that it will ultimately protect its GCC partners and, of course, mediation and discussions that continue to happen in Qatar.
Mm-hmm. Spending time with Natasha Hall from CSIS on Bloomberg TV and radio as we wait for the news conference, the bilateral news conference, to get underway at the White House with President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. To what extent do you expect the indulgence of questions here from the media, Natasha? President Trump most recently held a summit with Vladimir Putin. Not one question was taken in what was billed as a news conference. Will it depend on the outcome of their talks?
I mean, I think it could depend on the outcome of their talks, but we've seen, as you well know and pointed out, that President Trump continues to call on more right-leaning, favorable news outlets during these press conferences. And no doubt that will happen again, since this will be probably one of the more contentious press conferences, depending on how things went during these discussions. But again, I think that, President Trump is excellent at optics. Prime Minister Netanyahu, like I said, is a political animal. And so I think that they will be able to circumvent a lot of the more thorny questions. But we will see, because, again, Prime Minister Netanyahu was extremely defiant about not ending the war just last week. So it is going to be very difficult for him to speak both to Israelis, to hostage families, to the U.S. domestic audience, but also his far-right coalition, who not only don't want an end to this war, they want annexation of the West Bank and of Gaza. So it is going to be a very, very interesting press conference to watch. We all have to hope for an end to this war, but it'll be very interesting to see how they handle the optics of this.
Well, Natasha, Joe asked if this press conference is going to be influenced by what happens behind closed doors. I'm wondering what happens if diplomacy collapses today. Is that on the table here? What sort of mechanism is there to prevent that? What should we be looking forward as we look ahead to what is going to happen after those closed doors open?
Right. I mean, I think too often we look at the situation as a zero-sum game, that either there's going to be an agreement overall to a peace plan, or there's going to be nothing at all. I think what we've seen instead is this war kind of just dragging along. There being intermittent ceasefires, there being intermittent agreements. We keep hearing about how the plan is in the offing at any point in time, and then nothing seems to bear fruit over the course of days or weeks. And again, I think that both of these politicians are excellent at talking about, positively about some kind of agreement. But again, the devil is in the details in the days to follow. And there is very little patience on the part of President Trump to sort of deal with those details. And I think not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, but other world leaders recognize that, which is why you've seen so many deals, but then everything falls apart in the implementation, from Gaza to tariff deals. And so I think that, this press conference will be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of full agreement to this plan. But again, I think what we'll really would be watching in the days and weeks ahead is how things are actually implemented and what actually happens on the ground.
I'll be very curious to see what this meeting in New York led to. Natasha, thank you so much for being with us. Natasha Hall, CSIS, an expert in her field and a recurring voice on this program to our benefit, non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall here in Washington, where the news conference could get underway at any moment, though we understand from our reporters in the state dining room that things have apparently been delayed a bit, which would suggest that this conversation, Tyler, taking place behind closed doors, is not close to being finished.
Right. Absolutely. Crucial talks happening right now at the White House. Will be interesting to see who ends up in the room for this press conference. Which of President Trump's advisors, as we know that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, have really been leading these talks. And we're reminded that yesterday marks 1 week until October 7th and 2 years since that horrific day and the start of the war.
Pretty remarkable to think about. We've got our panel with us as well. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will weigh in as we walk up to the news conference at the White House. We'll bring that to you live and unfiltered here on Bloomberg, as you would expect, as soon as it begins. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg. As President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meet behind closed doors on a possible ceasefire. And of course, it's one that has not come easily, which is why this news conference is not starting on time. We've got a couple of empty rows in the front of the state dining room here where administration officials would tend to be sitting, though the room is set with and full of reporters, I should note, with two podiums, the American and Israeli flags put together here. As soon as it begins, we'll bring it to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. There's a live view of the room as reporters do their thing, waiting for this to begin when we don't know. But we do have our panel together and curious to hear the thoughts of Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino on what is about to happen here and what is being discussed behind closed doors. Both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeanne is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is partner at Stonecourt Capital. Rick, we'll start with you this time and what you expect to hear from these two. Will this be an announcement of a ceasefire or something more nuanced?
I'd say at a minimum, announcement of a process to get to a ceasefire. This kind of, showed up post-UN speech by Donald Trump and is an initiative to, try and take another crack at what was a really bad week for Prime Minister Netanyahu in New York. And so whether or not this turns into something that could actually become a ceasefire is too soon to tell. But I would be shocked that it is a full-on endorsement of a ceasefire by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been particularly good, not just with this president, but past presidents, of getting right up to the edge in these announcements, milking the moment in the Oval Office for his own gain, and then going home and finding ways to undermine the agreements that may or may not have actually been made. My guess is everyone's wise to that in the Trump administration and are working very diligently throughout the weekend and today to try and get some kind of an ironclad agreement. Whether they're able to accomplish that or not is yet to be seen. Maybe we'll hear about it this afternoon. But I would say, reminder, 3 o'clock, bicameral, bipartisan meeting in the Oval Office. The clock's ticking. These things can't all happen at the same time.
Right. It does seem like those congressional lawmakers might be a little bit delayed when it comes to their meeting at the White House later today. But Jeanne, I want to ask you about the political dynamic between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the fourth meeting between the two leaders since President Trump took office back in January. What is that calculus that they are making as they head into that press conference later today?
Yeah, I think, the reality is that Benjamin Netanyahu, to Rick's point, had a very bad week last week talking to an almost empty room at the UN. He has expressed an awful lot of concern about U.S. domestic politics, even to the point where some in the White House have wondered why he is so concerned. He had a meeting last week talking to conservative online folks, and he has had a falling out with Tucker Carlson, all of which seems to be weighing on him very heavily. And Donald Trump remains really one of his only allies in the world at this point. So Donald Trump has leverage here. The question's going to be, is he going to use it? And the reality is this 21-point plan, I think Netanyahu's going to signal interest, to Rick's point, maybe talk about moving forward. But I can't imagine he signs on to this thing the way it is written, because it leaves opening for things that Netanyahu said he would never agree to, like a potential opening for a Palestinian state or a potential for Hamas not to openly surrender. All of these things are things he has said before, even last week, are non-starters. So I think he's going to try to thread the needle here. I think the bigger question is, does Donald Trump, does Steve Witkoff, does Jared Kushner get so frustrated with these negotiations that they just express that frustration? And I think Donald Trump has done that in the past. I don't think he'd do it in a press conference with the Israeli prime minister, but you never know with Donald Trump.
You never know, which is why we're going to be watching and listening very closely. The president did say to reporters over the weekend that there would be no Israeli annexation of the West Bank, which is one of the 21 points in this plan. Let's listen to the press secretary. She was just talking about this, Caroline Levitt, about what is inside this proposal. Listen.
The president knows and believes that this is as good of a plan as these sides are going to see. And that's why it's 21 points. It's very detailed. It's comprehensive. The president has been working tirelessly on this. He speaks to, Prime Minister Netanyahu all of the time, of course. He's in constant correspondence. But he's also taken a lot of time to speak with our Arab partners and allies in the Middle East. He met with them at UNGA in New York City last week to hear them out. We've obviously had direct and indirect conversations with Hamas as well. And ultimately, the president knows when you get to a good deal, both sides are going to leave a little bit unhappy.
Okay, Rick, it doesn't sound like they're lowering expectations, though, ahead of this exercise. How much pressure is there on Benjamin Netanyahu to take what he is being served?
Well, I think there's enormous pressure on the prime minister right now, not only from the Gulf countries that the press secretary mentioned. We're meeting with the president during the UN General Assembly, who have had it with this conflict, whether it's Qatar, who's tired of having its sovereignty violated for what reason? By hosting negotiations for a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities, and the others, many of whom have Abraham Accords in place with Israel, are unhappy with the backfire that they're getting at home for having those relationships. And I would say, too, in speaking to my colleagues in Israel, they talk about the fact that many of these young IDF soldiers are basically the equivalent of our National Guard. They've been called up and are serving for over 300 days in uniform in combat situations. That is extraordinarily painful for the families of those individuals serving. And so I know that there's an enormous amount of internal pressure, both from those families and the hostage families, for Bibi Netanyahu to cut a deal. And maybe it's time he's going to hear those voices and actually try and come to the table earnestly.
Well, as Rick is mentioning, the Gulf countries in his earlier answer there, we are getting some breaking news on the terminal. The White House releasing a readout of a call between President Trump, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and also Qatari officials. I pulled this line for us here. It says that the leaders accepted the president's proposal to establish a trilateral mechanism to enhance coordination between these three countries. Jeanne, I'd just love your thoughts about the analysis here when it comes to how you're thinking about these other regional countries in the region, how they're playing into this broader picture as we try to push towards peace.
Yeah, I mean, they are a critical component of this. And there's a lot of reporting, and you yourself have done it, that, President Trump was either surprised or told very late about the hit in Qatar, and that frustrated him enormously. And so these countries have a role to play. I think one of the questions to be asked about this, when we're talking about President Trump drawing a red line as it pertains to the West Bank, if Israel agrees and then they go into the West Bank, what is the United States prepared to do about that? Number one, that has been an overarching question amongst many of these regional partners. Would the U.S. actually ever confront Israel in a concerted way if they were to violate these agreements? And so that remains an open question. And you look at this 21-point plan, and it's talking about things like an immediate release of these 48 hostages, dead or alive. And of course, we all hope that happens. It should have happened a long time ago. But these negotiations are between the United States and Israel. They don't involve Hamas at this point at all. And there seems to be this assumption, even with these regional states, that Hamas will swallow this. And it's not clear when you talk to people over there if that is the case. So I think there is a long way to go. And I think Trump is right to talk to these partners. He is right to have these phone calls that involve this large grouping. But the reality is that the president has to express that he is willing to stand up to Israel should they balk at any of these points. And we haven't seen that in U.S. history to date. And so that's going to be a big question.
Progressives, of course, in Congress see it a little bit differently, Jeanne. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, that's what, about 100 members, has actually voted to endorse the legislation, the Block the Bombs Act. And I wonder today, if there's no resolution, if we're maybe even further away from a ceasefire by the time this ends, will the calls to block weapons shipments to Israel grow louder here in Washington?
I think they could. So far, historically, they haven't been strong enough to get close. But, as we are looking at 66,000 people in the Gaza Strip dead in the last 2 years, and of course, people in Israel who were victimized by October 7th, those calls may grow indeed bigger. And I think we saw world public opinion shift on this. And it was very, very clear when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to that almost empty UN galley late last week. So public opinion has shifted here in the U.S. like it has abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And Rick, you had mentioned this earlier. President Trump has another high-stakes meeting scheduled later today with congressional leaders. I'm wondering if we should expect what happens in the room today with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to influence what we see later when he meets with those congressional leaders on the future of funding the government.
I don't know how many of them are connected, although it's certainly going to affect his mood. And we've seen Donald Trump's mood when he's in a good mood with leaders and jovial and charming. And when he's in a bad mood, he can be downright devastating. And so I think if he can come out with something that puts him in a good mood, and I don't mean this to be, too soft and fuzzy. It's not my style. But the reality is it's going to matter today. 1 hour from now, we're going to know how he's feeling about the congressional delegation. And of course, his primary whipping boy, Chuck Schumer, sitting just a few feet from him, could either have a really good outcome today or, be exposed to some really tough stuff like one of his colleagues, Nancy Pelosi, used to get in the Oval Office.
Well, it's an interesting prospect. Jeanne, Donald Trump has never met with Hakeem Jeffries. And Chuck Schumer, who Rick just mentioned, the president now openly refers to as a Palestinian. We've only got about a minute left. Is Tyler onto something here?
Oh, I think she absolutely is. And I keep privately saying if one of them shows up with a burnt orange coat today and sunglasses, I think you remember that was Nancy Pelosi's outfit for that 2018 meeting. And she put it on and she donned the sunglasses. And it was quite the meeting. So, I think on the heels of this with Netanyahu, they're going to have to hope he's in a good mood. But to your earlier conversation with Representative, there's not a lot of optimism about it. But yeah, watch for the burnt orange coat. Somebody's got to be wearing it.
Boy, we're reading tea leaves now. This is what happens when a news conference doesn't start for an hour. When it does begin, you'll hear it and see it on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're going to hand things over in a moment to Bloomberg Business Week Daily, but big thanks to our great panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. They'll meet us on the late edition of Balance of Power as well. We're going to know a lot more by then. In fact, Tyler, the congressional leaders could be at the sticks, as they say, at the stakeout location in the driveway. They'll let us know what happened.
Right, exactly. Might happen around 5 p.m. Eastern when you and I are back on air because, of course, Washington loves nothing more than a deadline. This is Bloomberg.